Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy it stopped raining a couple of hours ago. So you are all here now. That's very good. A Book of Silence is one of the books written by Sara Maitland, and I thought of starting this evening by just standing here and saying nothing. But then I thought that wouldn't be too polite for our guests. And I am, in fact, very proud to introduce to you Sara Maitland, writer, pioneer in the feminist movement, and part-time hermit. I think that's a very interesting combination of facts. She has written at least 2 books on silence and solitude, and she will speak tonight on how we are not used to being alone anymore, and how it is that despite the fact that we place a lot of value on personal freedom, on autonomy, we also think that being alone is a bit weird or even antisocial. So she will give a lecture of about 45 minutes, including a short, practice in being silent. And after that, she will be interviewed by theologian Christiane Alpes of our university. And it will include ample time for your own questions. My name is Liesbeth Jansen. I'm a program manager at Radboud Reflects. And I wish you a very inspiring evening.
Oh, great. Good. Jolly good. Thank you very much, Lisbeth. Thank you all for being here. Despite it, I've just realised that these are the most unsilent buttons I've ever encountered. Now I've probably messed the sound system up. Are we okay up there? Sorry about that. I put on my smart jacket for you, but it was useless. Hermits should avoid such things. As Lisbeth says, I now live and have lived for the last 20-odd years as a quasi-hermit. The quasi is because I do wash my clothes occasionally. Don't worry. But I have lived on my own and in as much silence as... Yeah, I see it as an experiment. I see my life as an experiment. See how much silence we can have in modernity. We'll come to why I'm doing this slightly odd thing in a bit. First, I should say that, like most traditional hermits, if we get a chance to talk, boy, do we talk. And one of the problems with doing that in a language which isn't your own is talking too fast. So there's nothing I can do about the fact that I know no Dutch except apologise. But there's quite a lot I can do about talking more slowly, if that's an issue. So if anybody thinks they'd do better if I talk Dutch, they can leave. And if anyone thinks they'd do better if I talk more slowly, could they just give me a wave? And then I'll give it a try. I live in the southwest corner of Scotland, which is one of the areas below the snow line that is one of the least populated areas of Britain. In fact, it's one of the least populated areas of Europe. There are some competitors, but it is very, very underpopulated, and I chose to live there because it was underpopulated. But there's a slight complication because it's also within 50 miles of where I grew up. So I both went home and went to a new place. And I have an enormous family, many of whom still live in this rather obscure corner of Scotland. So all round, I'm a bit of a cheat. But since I've been living there, the house that I live in at the moment, no, this probably is worth saying. The house that I live in at the moment was a ruin when I bought it just over 10 years ago now. I built it to be a house for a single person to live in. And I built it. I'm very, very proud of it. I've become even prouder of it since discovering from one of my brothers about 2 years ago that my other brother took a massive bet that I would not complete the build. So all I'm saying is that my aloneness is punctuated by my own personal history, inevitably. I mean, inevitably. Everybody's lives are punctuated by their own personal histories. And holding one's personal history together with one's present choices is part of the interest to me of what I do. But what I mainly do, or try to do, is look at why this is a weird thing to do. Why solitude and silence and interiority have become so culturally weird. I see the central problem that I test against my own personal experience goes something like this. The question is, how have we arrived in the relatively prosperous, developed world at least, at a cultural moment which values autonomy, personal freedom, fulfillment, an interesting word, we'll come back to it, fulfillment and human rights, and above all, individualism, more highly than they have ever been valued in human history, and at the same time, these autonomous, free, self-fulfilling, wonderful individuals are terrified of being alone with themselves. I think there really is a profound cultural problem. So what we're meant to be is perfectly free individuals annoying a large range of other perfectly free individuals. Well, we're probably not meant to be annoying them, but in effect we're going to be annoying them. That is the reality of where we live. I think this is particularly interesting, and now, it's a now question, because it has not always been the case that in Western culture there's been an endless fluctuation between the needs of the community, the individual's oneness with their community, and the needs of the individual. And solitude kind of marks that, if that's the word for it. It changes and it shifts. The Romans were people who valued your personal performance in public very, very highly. A competent Roman was brought up for something called the cursus honorum, the course of honours. And honours in that context meant public duties. You were educated in rhetoric, that's public speaking. In law, that's public governance. And if you wanted to be a educated person of any respectability, you worked up these layers. You could do it through the army, or you could do it through the civic society, but you nonetheless were expected to do it. And people like Cicero, who reflected on what it was to be a good Roman, expressed it very clearly, really. Well, it would do if I could find the marker. Cicero was a lawyer-philosopher, or a philosopher-liar, depending on which you prefer, who came for later Romans to represent the kind of absolute model of late Republican morals. Anybody who wanted to bitch about the empire would say, well, Cicero wouldn't have had any part in that. But he felt very, very strongly that the people of the highest character and noblest genius, there is to be In men of the highest character and noblest genius, there is to be found an insatiable desire for honor, command, power, and glory. He himself represented that and articulated it. This is just sort of in the last century BC. He was a statesman, he was a lawyer, he was an orator. His views on oratory were quite interesting, but we won't go there now. Apart from anything else, he thought you had to have a splendid sense of humour to be a good orator, because although the plebs might listen to politics, the aristocracy would only listen to jokes. We might or might not want to apply that. But he did think that what marked a high character was a greed for power and authority. And then he also introduced Rome to Greek philosophy, felt that that would enable them to ride out some very, very difficult times when this kind of high standard of civic service was collapsing under various other pressures, and how the early republic and the Greek city-state had taught people how to be citizens. Citizenship, social citizenship was for him the model of both the happy and the good. And indeed, you know, the word civilization itself comes from the Latin word civis, which means a citizen, and the words polite and political both come from the Greek word for city. That's what you're meant to be. You were meant to be a citizen who was a city dweller, engaged in the governance of your city. That was a model that most Romans of good breeding believed had brought them to be, as I'm sorry to say, the British still do, the moral leaders of the universe. We were wrong. I suspect they were too. That's not for me to say so. And then into that highly socialized, I mean, just for example, if you're a Roman, you had to bath publicly because you had to be seen to be clean. It wasn't good enough to be clean. There was no going into your shower and locking the door. It wasn't just you ought to be clean, it's all you to be known to be clean, which is probably why the Romans had the lowest problem with nakedness, nudity, of any culture we've ever come across. You might as well show it all, mightn't you, if you're going to bath with it. They were deeply, deeply committed to a social human being. Into this fairly stable, long-lived, but complicated, increasingly complicated community turned up a new religion which said exactly the opposite. It said, your primary relationship is not with the state, it's not with your community. Don't worry what anybody thinks of you, it only matters what God thinks of you, and that's between you and God. Paul had a bit of problems with it's just between you and God because he wanted it to be between you and Paul as well. But for most early Christians, it was between you and God. That was the relationship you ought to be deepening, not your relationship with your citizen state. It was very disruptive. I mean, the really good example of this is about martyrdom. The Roman state clearly did not really want to martyr anyone. It was a bit disorderly, it was a bit unnecessary, and it was silly, and most of them didn't believe it. It is very, very clear that most of the ruling class in Rome didn't believe these sacrifices did anything except establish good public order. And the problem with Christians is they didn't seem to care about public order. There were more weirdo religions in the late years of the Republic, even than there are in America at the moment. Oh, sorry. And these were two cultures that completely banged into each other was kind of very, very difficult. It was quite difficult for Christians being fed to lions every Saturday, but it was also quite difficult for Romans having to feed people to the lions. There was a lot of tension, and before that tension could really work itself through and find a compromise position, Rome fell. The fall of Rome in 410, the withdrawal of the legions from Britain and subsequently from Gaul in the 30 years before that, was psychologically devastating. I mean, you see it in Augustine's Apologia, Confessions. You see it all over. People could not bear what had happened. They couldn't understand what would happen. Even people who were not pro-Roman could not imagine how life would be without the empire. Rather sensibly, as it turned out, because what happened? Waves of migrants. Waves and waves of them. Goths and Visigoths and super Goths. A bit later, some Vikings and some Angles and some Saxons. A very steady collapse of what is known as order, what used to be called, but we don't call it that anymore, the Dark Ages, and who emerged as the representatives of normal, reasonable society, but the church. So whether or not the church had any causational role, this is something that Edward Gibbon, for example, addressed very much. Did Christians bring down the empire? The answer is, I think not. I really think not. I think they were just one more problem. What brought down the empire was a whole lot of Goths burning Rome. Very tasteless. And then settling. But it left this curious vacuum where the only source of stability was the people who destabilized it. And I don't think we've ever quite recovered from that extraordinary conflict between the model of personal holiness, me relating to God and doing the best for the world, but only in relation to that primary discourse of salvation, and a citizen's first duty is to the state. And for the next nearly, not quite, 2,000 years, we wrestled this out in a kind of wave, so that, for example, solitariness was extremely popular in the late Middle Ages. It was a very popular movement. You have to, I think, see saints fulfilling the role that celebrities fill now. They don't have to be very saintly. What they have to be is very visible and willing to perform that role. And a lot of those saints were, in fact, solitaries of various degrees, so that solitariness became holiness, became therefore spiritual empowerment, and that was now fixed around a model of stability. And that went on very nicely for quite a long time. And then, as these things do, the swings, we hope it's going to swing back again, but that's another story. We'll get onto that later. After a couple of hundred years of solitariness and extreme rigorous self-discipline, asceticism, solitariness, the piety, you have the Enlightenment, which quite consciously saw itself as replicating Roman morals as well as Roman culture. And they went right back to a kind of anti-solitary mood, including some really vicious hatred of hermits. They probably didn't know any. So on the one hand, you've got people setting up, there was a sort of fashion in England, I don't know if you had it here, for garden hermits. If you had a nice big landlord, you tried to find a hermit to come and live in your garden because it was very stylish. But actually they hated hermits. Here's Edward Gibbon, who wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, so it's kind of in there. There is perhaps no phase in the moral history of humankind of a deeper or more painful interest than this ascetic epidemic. He's referring to the 4th century hermit movement here. A hideous, distorted, emaciated maniac without knowledge, without patriotism, without natural affection, spending his life in a routine of useless and atrocious self-torture. It has become the ideal of nations which had known the writings of Plato and Cicero, the lives of Socrates and Cato. Hermits stink. James Wilson, who is a rather less good writer, I think we'd have to say, than Gibbon, wrote, an ascetic monk or so-called self-secluded man, probably a sulky, egotistical fellow who could not accommodate himself to the customs of his fellow creatures. Such beings do very well to write bad sonnets about. Now they are, we sincerely trust, all dead and buried. But the reader may depend on it, they were a vile pack. I'm not quite sure how St. Cuthbert or St. Anthony would have felt about that, but we're now in a very, very strong attempt to get back to that model of a social culture that supports civic well-being over social fulfillment. And as these things do, it kind of swung back with Romanticism, where suddenly solitude became a beautiful thing again. We have I'm sure many of you know, a poet called Wordsworth, who shambled about at the top of extremely bleak hills, burbling on about the bliss of solitude, about how the world, by which he meant anyone who was critical of him, about how the world oppressed the natural genius, that what you had to do was get away if you wanted to express your own creativity, as we'd put it nowadays. You had to kind of get society out of your head. That became extremely popular, that idea that the pure me was contaminated by you. You as a collective, unspecified something, since all these people did in fact seem to wish to learn to read. It was, contemporary society contaminated the soul. Now, the real reason for this history is that I think we've arrived in a new place, in a way, where we're completely divided between these two things. So on the one hand, we're very, very keen on our own autonomy, our own individualism. But at the same time, we want to be permanently in contact or connected to other people all the time. Now, what could it actually mean to have 4,337 Facebook friends? What can it possibly mean that 52% of people separated from their mobile phones demonstrate symptoms of anxiety? I mean, what is going on that these people who are arguing for the beauty of individualism can't bear to be alone? It's, I think, a very kind of curious and problematic and deeply problematic that we've over-invested in personal relationships. We've increasingly under-investing in teaching children, particularly children, but grown-ups too, to use solitude, to get the gains of it. And at the same time as that, everyone actually knows that solitude and silence are rather good for you, unless they happen to drive you psychotically mad. And they do occasionally drive people psychotically mad, but so, as a matter of fact, does everything else. It might be easier to say some people are psychotically mad, and we should take them out of our working out what is for the human good. No, it doesn't seem to me very obvious that young people who are massively attended to now. There was a very interesting program on the radio quite recently in which people were asked what was their happiest memory from childhood. And over again, people talked about being alone or being just with their peer group in wild places, in the countryside, doing nothing, right? Same people were asked on the same program if they let their children do that, and they all said, no, it would be too dangerous. In Britain, at least, except for the year of the Dunblane killings. The Dunblane killings were a very bizarre episode in which somebody, who as a matter of fact probably was nuts, shot 53 children in a playground. Well, that did put up the figures for child deaths by strangers that year. But apart from that year, the figures are absolutely flat. The same number of children are killed by strangers as were in 1953. Last year, same as 1953. And yet our perception that children are put endlessly at risk by being alone means that there are actually fewer children for the perverse killers of small children to kill. So you could say the statistics had risen, but I think that would be a rather perverse way of looking at what's happening. That children have very little solitude, and this is very odd because they're more likely to have to deal with it when they're grown up than they ever have been before. That the number of single-person households, for example, is increasing very fast. Children growing up in very small families is increasing very fast. The length of widowhood for women is increasing in time very fast, surprisingly fast, even though men too are living to be older. Basically, everybody at some point in their life is likely to have to be alone. Is likely to be living by themselves, and we have no positive models for that. So I think there really is there's a sort of thing that makes me joke, it makes me laugh in a way, about the word loner. I don't quite know how that would work in Dutch, but loner is a word for somebody who lives alone, right? Sorry, excuse me a moment. Right, a loner has become, in Britain at least, a kind of tabloid shorthand for psychotic sexual killer. He was a loner. Everyone was a loner. You don't even have to live alone to be a loner. All you have to do is kill a young woman. Ideally two. That proves you're a loner. Now that's quite new. I don't know. Did you have the Lone Ranger in Holland? Well, he was not a psychotic murderer. He had some very strange habits, but he certainly wasn't meant to. I looked up loner on Wikipedia, and this is what we heard. We had avoidant personality disorder, autism, dysfunctional family, hikikomori, which is the Japanese version of autism, introversion, loneliness, lone wolf trait, major depressive disorder, misanthropy, recluse, schizoid personality disorder, social phobia, social rejection, and tragic hero. Right? Here are the words we didn't have, or some of them, because this jumps out of my head. We did not have adventurer, sensitive, mystic, creative genius, bereaved person, castaway, victim of solitary confinement, or wanderer. all of which are kind of loner professions. We have become absolutely terrified. We do not have the social confidence that Romans had just to say, well, that's what you ought to be doing, you ought to be sociable. We have to make aloneness, silence, interiority threatening, and threatening in a wider sense. It's not just it's threatening to my sanity, my living alone is threatening to my mother's sanity. Well, actually, apparently it killed her. I'm sorry. My mother is dead. It is not threatening to her sanity at the moment, but while she was alive, she was tied up in a hideous discourse of how it was bizarrely selfish, not for me to be on my own, but for me to enjoy being on my own. And a lot of me has a great compassion for her because she was widowed quite young. She adored my father, but it was impossible for her to imagine that anybody would be happy on their own, and that therefore, if they said they were happy on their own, they were either lying, I'll come back to that one because it's very interesting, or they were so profoundly selfish that not making tea for somebody each day proved that they were immorally inferior. We laugh, but actually it's quite common with a lot of people. Try telling your friends you think you won't come to the pub today because you'd rather go for a silent walk at night. You may find there's more people like my mother than you might think. Actually, my mother was fabulous in lots of other ways. My mother was great, but she certainly was part of a culture that believed that one-to-one personal relationships were the only method of fulfillment, despite the fact that she also thought that divorce was a moral disaster. So if you push everybody into marriages, my brother used to say to her, what do you think's going to happen, Mummy? They're not all going to like each other. I think we've reached a cultural kind of hiatus. And what is very strange about this hiatus is that we actually have fairly good evidence that in certain respects, solitude and silence, how they cross over, I think is a problem. Is a discursive problem, since they usually actually go together. Not an awful lot of people spend time, Trappist monks do. But on the whole, most people who want to be silent, don't want to be silent in large groups of other people. Solitude and silence have a kind of connection. I'm very open to discussing that. Sorry, my worries about not being rude to anybody has deflected me from my course. We live in a society that wants impossible ends. They want no one to be alone. They want everyone to be totally authentic and true to themselves. And they're frightened of silence. I suspect that some of that is fear of death. And anyone who isn't frightened of death is a bit thick. You should give it some passing kind of acknowledgement that you really don't know what will happen next, and it's slightly worse than falling over a dam, because you might get rescued. If you fall over a dam, you won't get brought back if you're dead. But we're living in this culture, and we know that it is very good for us in some ways. I'm going to read you some of the ways that it's researchedly good for you. There are 5 known positive effects of extreme solitude. Extreme is perhaps not the right word there, extended solitude. Proven is a bit dodgy, but frequently reported over the last 150 years would do. So for solitude, it's a deeper consciousness of oneself, a deeper attunement to nature, that is both the perceiving of it and the enjoying what you perceive. There's a nice quotation, which is, being on your own teaches you your place in the world and the world's place in you. A deeper relationship with the transcendent, the numinous, the divine, spiritual, increased creativity and an increased sense of freedom. Well, frankly, if those are true, it sounds a great deal better than going to a very noisy discotheque for the evening. positively advantageous. The experiences of silence are more complicated, partly because they're extremely under-recorded. When I discovered what I do in Book of Silence, is both personally experiment with silence, of which, silence in different places. I went to the desert, I went to islands, I went to cities. I hated the cities, I only stayed for 3 days, so that doesn't count. But experiences of silence, and then trying to match them to experiences of silence across history. Some of the best reporters of silence, although there's a problem with it as data, in the 60s, people started sailing single-handedly around the world in yachts. The advantage was that, first of all, it was the 60s, so things were changing, but more importantly, it's very expensive to sail around the world single-handed in a yacht. So in order to do it, you had to sell your story, all the first 8 entries to the Golden Globe race, all wrote books about it. And suddenly readers wanted to know how you felt, so all these kind of stiff upper-lip blokes are wrestling for a language of emotion. Some of them were better at it than others, bless them. And of course, the sad thing there is we don't, from exactly the same period, have any women's accounts. Because at that point, women either couldn't raise the money or were too sensible to want to sail around the world single-handed. You can take your pick on that one. But what we started getting was reports of people who were on their own in silence for a long time without a direct religious impulse to do it, which there's nothing wrong with a religious impulse to do it. I did it from a religious impulse very strongly, but it does sort of slew the evidence. Nobody who sets out to do it for a religious impulse is going to tell the Sunday Times that being on their own absolutely proved that God did not exist. It's just not the way we go with our own egos, is it? However, we did, over the last 50 years, a bit more, we've had more and more sort of competent accounts, really, of silence. And I've come up with a list of 8 experiences of silence, which are possibly, probably, maybe, also experiences of solitude, but I've tried to separate the experiences as far as one can. Okay, so the eight that I would say that I've both read extensively elsewhere and would confirm as happening to me. So it's not an exclusive list, and it's not proven exactly. But the 8 particular experiences that would do are an intensification of both physiological and psychological sensation. This is a very fabulous thing that happens. If you're silent for long enough, food tastes wonderful. Less wonderful is the fact that if you're cold and wet, you're so cold and wet. But it does seem a repeated experience that articulating what you feel cuts across the feeling. So if you've got no one to tell, the physical stuff is fairly easy to deal with. Emotional intensification can be pretty scary, as a matter of fact. But I still think it is an actual consequence of being alone. A sort of disinhibition, some of which is entirely obvious. The shame of picking your nose in public is rather reduced if there's no one around. But I do actually think there's something more that happens, that if you're silent, particularly if you're away from other people, something in you relaxes, perhaps. And if you don't find the consequences of that totally scary, it's actually rather enjoyable. Whenever I go on a prolonged retreat on my own, I suddenly realize it's 8 days since I took a bath. Well, I'm not really advocating filth as a moral stand, but in normal social life, I'd never go 8 days without a bath. Not on kind of moral grounds or unmoral grounds. It's just after a few days you have a bath. Actually, you don't need to have a bath that often, I can assure you. I did have one this morning, don't worry. Disinhibition. And then you get into the really good things like a sense of givenness or connection, which is a very common experience both for explorers who have it in relation to nature and saints who have it in relation to God. That absolute sense that you are part of everything, and what usually ends those states is a kind of assertion of ego. And I know nobody who reaches those states while not silent, except, if I may say so in heavy brackets, just occasionally for the lucky people, and I'm not one of them, in sex. So it does seem to be possible there. But the most normal experience of total connection with the universe is on your own, and I think is an effect of silence. A form of auditory hallucination, which is quite difficult to pin down because it's clearly not a psychotic symptom. Lindbergh, the first person to fly the Atlantic, had ghostly figures who advised him on his navigation. They'd step forward from the back of the aeroplane and tell him what he ought to do next. Now, we know that Lindbergh was not a nutcase. In fact, he was an intensely boring human being. So what is happening when silence induces a sort of hyper-hearing? I have a theory about this, but I won't go into it now. It's quite interesting, but it certainly seems to be the case that whether you're hearing it as the voice of God or you're hearing it as the voice of your own insanity, it doesn't matter. When I did my longest silent retreat, after about week 2, I became absolutely convinced there was a male voice choir singing Latin psalms in the bedroom. And what was really interesting about it is I knew perfectly well the word. And the two things could exist together. I think the Latin's quite interesting, because I don't have very good Latin, but I have some. So I know how to make sense of what they were saying without it feeling like a completely alien language. I mean, if they'd been talking Japanese, I'd have been in trouble. I think that would be right. I think there's another thing that happens is a boundary confusion. The lines between time and place, but time particularly, interior and exterior, self and other, except there is no other. All those things get very, very blurred after long silence, which I think is sometimes interpreted as insanity, but I don't see it needs to be. It's actually very pleasant. It's jolly nice to think that you might be a babbling brook today, or whatever. An exhilarating consciousness of being at risk, which is really just a regression to childhood. Do you remember how exciting it was to go on those appalling fairground rides? Ideally the kind that tipped you upside down. We were meant to be scared. Scared was great. We tend to lose that, I think. It's a jolly nice feeling when you get it. And ineffability. Ineffability is the term that we have in Britain for a feeling that something cannot be expressed in words. Is there a Dutch term for that? Is there a Dutch word for ineffability? There's lots of Dutch words for it. Jolly good, up the Dutch. Ineffability is held by quite a lot of writers on the mystical life to be proof of the validity of the mystical experience. If you can't actually explain what happened, it wasn't a mystical experience. Well, it's not going to exactly encourage people to try and work it out, is it? If you can tell me what happened, it didn't happen. It doesn't seem very useful. But my own sense that there is a deep mystery that is out with language. It's not just without language. Out with is a Scottish word that doesn't exist in English, which means without there being any absence. So if you have a cottage just outside a village, you live out with the village. You don't live without the village. And for us, the famous example is there's a hideous, really, Good Friday hymn, which goes, "There was a green hill far away without a city wall." And the number of children who are completely baffled as to why on earth a green hill would have a city wall around it is in fact because without means something entirely different. That means it was outside the city. And I think that ineffability, those things that are without language, are out with language, are a consequence of silence, that there is a meaning, a depth in good quality silence that cannot be pulled into language. And I think we need to be very, very careful about writing that off as nothingness, as void, as absence. I think we're wrong to suggest that silence is simply an absence of noise. Silence is simply a different state. It has an ontology of its own. And the final kind of benefit of silence is bliss. The joys of silence are blissful rather than happy. They are transcendent. They are great. It's worth hearing a few loony monks singing in your bedroom. Wordsworth, the poet, speaks about the bliss of solitude. I speak about the bliss of silence. I think that that is very often what the mystical saints are talking about, what the extreme romantic poets are talking about, and what we have lost all contact with in our present culture. So what I'm really wanting to do is to urge people to just try a little silence. It may not work for you, there's introverts and there's extroverts. It's not a moral judgment, it's an observation. Obviously, introverts are going to like silence more than extroverts do, just as extroverts are going to like jazz dancing more than introverts do. I don't think that silence is something for everyone, but I do think that while we spend a lot of time and energy teaching our children to be sociable, communicators, team players, all those things, we don't spend a minute teaching them to find out if perhaps really they're introverts. My favourite example of this, with which I will stop, is I have this great theory that nobody should use sending a child to their bedroom as a punishment. Instead of saying, "You're a complete pain in the arse, go to your bedroom," I'm sure none of you would say that to your children. If you can't behave yourself, go to your bedroom. We should say, "Darling, you've been so sweet and good all afternoon that you can now go to your bedroom and be on your own for half an hour and mean it." Right? Why is that not giving at least half the children in the world an enormous treat? Why is silence to be despised, to be looked at as vacuum, as emptiness, when it has a long history of liberation, of creativity, of freedom, and of bliss? And I think that's what I want to say. What I thought we might do is give it a try. I think we might. Some people find this very, very difficult. And if you want to go mad in the middle, you can all give a loud scream. But I thought we might try being silent for 5 minutes. If you don't know what to do in the silence, go with John Cage, who says there is no silence, and see it as a chance to listen to what silence sounds like. Okay? Well, I'm not even asking you, actually, I'm telling you. I keep trying to do that liberal guff, but it never works. I invite you all to be silent for a few minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A. Pretty good. Pretty good. Thank you. I hope you're clapping yourselves. I'm going to stop there for a bit. We're going to have some... a kind interviewer is going to tell me what I got wrong. Okay. Are we struggling? Oh. I'll just leave it for now.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Sarah. This was really inspiring and quite a powerful experience, I think, at the end.
Thank you.
And when I was listening to you, and especially you talking about that we should teach our children again to appreciate silence, I was just wondering about school, about our schools. And isn't school, as it is now, for many children, the first place where they do experience a kind of silence, where they are consistently asked to be silent? But sometimes, of course, the teacher is talking. But sometimes also there are periods when they have to read, when they have to solve certain tasks. And especially in exams also, there can be almost pure silence. And I wonder if this is the same silence that you're referring to, or is it a different kind of silence?
Well, first of all, we don't seem to confine our children to silence as young as perhaps you do here. I mean, nobody gets examined in anything until they're 12 or 13.
Okay.
They get tested, but those are always communication tests, if you see what I mean.
Okay.
So they're not silent. There have actually been some very interesting experiments of getting children settled down and silent even for quite short periods of time, which seems to improve discipline in the classroom. Silence is, in that sense, discharging for them. But no, I mean, I think most people would say we are very, very bad at keeping our primary school children quiet. They never seem to have to be quiet at all. So we may be talking about different models of education. I know absolutely nothing about Dutch primary schools. What age do you start?
Well, personally, I'm from Germany, so...
What age does school in Holland start? In the Netherlands start, sorry.
I think at 4, but I'm not sure how silent the kids have to be at that age. Probably also not, but...
I think that where children are kept quiet in school, they're kept quiet as a discipline, not as a grace.
Yeah.
Nobody says, what should we do that would be really, really fun?
And do you think it has to be? Does silence, as you experience the silence you're talking about, does that have to be something more freely chosen, something that's not imposed on people, something?
I think, based on my research, that the thing that is most likely to go badly wrong for people in silence, and it does go badly wrong, is if that silence is not chosen. So there's a lot of data on prisoners in solitary confinement, for example, where it has to be said the silence does not do them any good at all. Scary, scary disorientation, loss of identity, self-harming. And funnily enough, that 8 points effects of silence, which I was giving as positive points, can be almost exactly reversed into the experience of compulsory. It doesn't work for everybody. Lots of people, for one reason or another, of whom Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress, would be a famous example. He never wrote anything. He battered around being rather unhappy until he was thrown into solitary confinement when he had a profound religious experience and didn't want to be released, because he just thought it was the best thing that ever happened to him.
So it can happen. But
I wrote a massively popular, still in print book from 400 years, you know. But I think, yes, on the whole, I would think that people, that silence should be freely chosen. But you can't freely choose something you know nothing about. This is where it comes back to the children. You can't hardly expect somebody to choose 4 years of silence if they've never had 4 minutes of it. And I think in most areas, we'd think that we'd want to give our children as wide an experience as possible. You know, most of them are not going to grow up, in my case, thank God, to be international gymnasts. But still, you know, it's nice for them to go to the gym.
Yeah.
Now, you don't need to be going to end up as a hermit to find out whether silence might be fun for you.
Yeah.
Whether solitude might be fun for you. We live in a society that says children need this constant accompaniment. Maybe some children do, but yeah, I think the freedom to choose depends on you knowing what choices are available.
Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That
So
you
that I
can't
think
choose
that
anything that you have never experienced.
That some sort of experience of silence in education should be there as much as some sort of experience of some kind of sport. Books, good Lord. You know, that's all I'd say. I'd say it's a profoundly important part of human life, and children ought to have a chance to see if that's... You know, I'd like all children to have a chance to try playing a musical instrument too.
Yeah.
Even though I don't expect all of them to... I mean, the world would be really bad if everyone was a concert pianist, wouldn't it? And what I think is, at the moment, we're at a cultural moment where children being on their own or silent is regarded as worrying.
Yeah. But when you, for example, read a book or give a child a book to read, do you think that is silence or is it communication with someone?
Oh, this is the big one. This is a really, really big one. It's made particularly complicated if we start with children because, of course, all new readers don't read silently.
Yeah.
Right? You have to learn to read. You know what it's like? So you start with... this is in Dutch. You don't start with it. But you know how... new readers practically have to say it aloud, and then they have to say it moving their lips. And then suddenly you learn to read with your mouth shut. So in that sense, when you start to read a book, it isn't a silent experience, but you can't get to the silent experience. But I think there's a more serious underlying question, and has been interpreted actually in different ways historically, as to whether or not, in English, the word silence has, if you look in the big dictionary, has 2 meanings which are actually contradictory. That silence means both an absence of noise and it means an absence of language. So that if there's a babbling brook and some wind in the trees, but otherwise there's no human noises, that's silent. And for some people, I think it is. But the other way round is a bit more complicated because obviously if silence is an absence of language, then reading a page of a book cannot be silent because the whole page is simply blotted up with language. And interestingly, poetry was defined by T.S. Eliot as writing with lots of silence around it. It's very nice, meaning lots of blank page. So I really think, and that one has also been complicated in the religious tradition, that on the whole, probably because of Benedict, who thought that a monastery without books was like a fort without armory. He thought that reading was part of the monastic experience. That's much less so of the churches of the East, much less inclined towards reading and book study, and is, of course, within some Buddhist traditions, absolutely a negative of silence, that reading to yourself. So, I mean, the problem is there's not many of us in the West now who have tried either long enough to tell you the answer. You know?
Yeah, of course.
I read, I can't imagine not reading, I feed my face by writing. Sometimes I feel that having a dog is a bit of cheating for being a hermit. My dog's fabulous, by the way. But I never feel that for me, reading or writing is somehow short-circuiting what I'm trying to do. But that could be because I have bad personal judgment. But there is a long division, sort of historic division between those people who think that reading is a silent experience and those people who think it is a language experience. It's very ambivalent.
Yeah.
And it's made more ambivalent, because people actually couldn't read silently until about the 4th century.
Yeah, true. And it makes sense that in a single lifetime you just can't compare all the different thoughts. But I wonder, since you have such a long experience with silence already, are you still experiencing new things, like really absolutely new things in silence?
Yes, all the time. But some of them aren't experiences directly of silence. Sorry, that sounds ridiculous. I have become, and continue apparently to become, a much better noticer of natural phenomena of nature. Like this, just before I left home, I discovered we have a plant, I don't know how you'd called it, which is called a blackthorn, and it flowers before it puts its leaves on. But it's not flowering yet. It has buds that look like tiny little cauliflowers. I have never noticed them before last Tuesday or Wednesday.
Okay. Wow.
That is a new experience, and it's an experience that I know, for me, comes out of silence. But I'm not sure how world-changing the discovery that blackthorn has. This comes out of an extraordinary and growing sense of how much silence there is in the world. And part of it is that all organic growth is silent. All those, we did not hear a single one of all those daffodils in Den Haag. They didn't go, pop! It's silent.
True.
2 months ago, they weren't there. There was nothing to see. In 2 months, they have grown probably about 18 inches. Have put out these extraordinarily brightly fires, and they didn't make a sound. Organic growth is silent. As a matter of fact, lots of other things are silent as well that we forget about. Gravity. Things under the influence of gravity make some noise, but gravity itself, it's not lying there saying, come little stone, come. It's silent. And of course, the one that is scary is that all of space is silent. As soon as you get beyond the atmosphere, because sound can't travel through a vacuum. That is an awful lot of silence. So it seems to be quite important that we should both enjoy it and find it meaningful, actually, because otherwise we're really alone in the world.
It is fascinating that the sharpening of the senses seems to continue even after such a long time with silence.
Well, it could be because my life's so boring, I've got nothing better to do, but I don't experience it that way.
But I also wonder, since you seem to have this attraction to silence, or seem to have had it for a long time, as something that is positive and enjoyable in itself, so to say, and this is the one strand that I can see in your thought and talking. But the other strand is that if people say this is selfish, it's selfish to pursue it, you want to convince them of the opposite. And
that's because I'm a very bossy person. That's got no philosophical basis. That's a psychological thing. I'm one of 6 children. The top 5 of us are within just over 6 years of each other. If you weren't self-assertive, you never got anything.
Okay.
It's why we also, and we still joke about it, we all eat incredibly fast. And we know perfectly well we eat fast, because if you're not the first person to finish, there won't be any more. Not because we were starved, but just because, well, there were a lot of us. Okay, more seriously, yes, I would like to persuade people, although, of course, the only people that are available to be persuaded are people who don't need persuading. Like, presumably everybody who came tonight thought that silence was possibly quite interesting. All the people who think it's mad or bad or sad didn't come.
Well, you never know.
Did anyone come here thinking we could always shoot her? No. You do not have to answer that question. It's not just that I like it. It's that I'm excited by it. Suddenly, when I was nearly 50, when my children had left home, I suddenly found the most exciting thing. And yeah, in that sense, I'm proselytizing. Yeah, I think everybody should try it. In fact, I think everybody should enjoy it. And if they don't, it's because they're sad and mad and bad.
But do you think...
But also, sorry, can I just finish that sentence?
Yeah, of course.
Also, if you live on your own and in silence, it's quite hard to find ways of making money. One of the ways you can make money is write persuasive books. Then people buy them and you've got some money and you can pay your tax. I'm serious about that. It's lucky if you want to be a silent person in the culture that we live in to be a writer.
Yeah. No, I
It
can
might be
imagine.
okay to be a potter, but there aren't a lot of options. No, seriously, even if you're like a hill sheep farmer, they're quite noisy sheep. They go, my book's never going, sorry. But it's, of course, nothing's pure, desire may be pure, but there's no pure way of working it out. A friend of mine said to me recently, Sarah, all this solitude is completely fake. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, every morning you get up and you switch the light on and you switch the light switch and you expect the light to come on. And I said, yeah, don't you? And she said, who makes that electricity? If you go to the shop and you buy some food, somebody's selling you that food. If you read a book, someone's writing that book. You're no more alone than I am. Well, I won't go on with the rest of the argument. But in one way, that's true. In one way, all you're saying is, this interests me most. And if it interests you most, you want to tell other people that it's interesting, particularly if you're living in a culture which says it's boring and mad.
Yeah, but I'm still also interested in the other side of the question. Do you think if a society had a few hermits and no one would know of them, would that still serve the society? I mean, just what you think personally about it. What is your intuition?
I think I shall need a lot of silence to answer that question.
Okay.
I think that is a really interesting question. I think that for me, that would be, for me personally, yes, there would be an effect. But that's actually not about silence itself, but about my own faith. That I feel that we have been served by hermits in that sense of prayer and holding the universe stable almost. That it doesn't matter whether anybody knows or whether they don't. Because they know the result even without knowing the cause. But another bit of me thinks, actually, I'd be headbanging if nobody listened to me. I think that's a seriously interesting question, whether some people holding the silence. There's a very, very beautiful Irish monastic text in which somebody asks this community, after the Romans have withdrawn, what the hell they think they're doing in this increasing chaos, and they say, we're lantern bearers. We bear the lantern that keeps a tiny light through the night, because one day there may be a dawn. And I suppose I'd want to say that not necessarily of my own, but of that tradition that says we do it because it needs to be done. We need to keep that candle alight. Maybe. Sounds awfully solemn, doesn't it?
No, thank you very
I
much.
think we live in a culture that is fragmented, noisy, scary. I think we need lantern bearers. I think we as a society need lantern bearers. This has a sort of kind of edge to it because I live in the only dark sky park in Europe, which is a place that has so little ground light that you get spectacularly good view of stars. And you get all sorts of, well, we won't get any more EU money, will we? Whose fault was that? To maintain the dark sky park. So all our villages in the area have downward-facing street lights, special LED lights that don't pollute. I think it's possible to see silence holders, silence dwellers, silence carriers as doing what stars do on a good night. They don't in any way make this. It's not like the sun. The sun makes everything light. The stars don't make anything light, but they shine in the dark. I think that can't be I think we're at quite a perilous cultural, historical point at this moment. I think everybody should be trying everything, really. Lace making. Any lace makers? I mean, it'd be a pity to lose that skill, wouldn't it? But I think it'd be more of a pity to lose the tradition of silence than of cushion lace making, actually.
I agree. So I could ask you so many more questions, but I think we should also give the audience a chance because they might have some as well. So if you have a question, could you just raise your hand and ask it in English if possible? And then there are two people with a mic who will come and just hold the mic closely so that everybody can hear. Yes, there is someone here in the front.
Thanks for your lecture. I'm a long-term meditator, and I have noticed and experienced all the 8 things you described about silence. But I have a question. What do you do if you have like a non-conceptual mind, that you are silent in your mind? What's the next step?
Sorry, say that again.
If you are silent in your mind, like you don't have any thoughts, a non-conceptual mind, what's the next step if you are in silence? Do you think of new ideas or?
I think
so. If you already don't think in concepts anymore, what comes next? What's the next?
When I get there, I'll tell you. When I have entirely zened my soul, I'll let you know what comes next. But to be serious for a moment, I think that question posits quite a lot about traditions, right? So that a Zen tradition is to literally get to the point that you have no concepts. A Quaker tradition is to get to the point where you can hear the Holy Spirit through somebody else moved to speak, that it's a communal silence. The Christian tradition, although is perhaps something about both a personal relationship with the resurrected Christ and or an increase of the love in the world. What do I do on those astonishingly lucky occasions that I actually get to quiet both my head and my heart is usually feel so smug that I have a hot shower. But if you mean more seriously, what's the long-term goal of it? I think that's a valid question. What I'm about to say is not meant to invalidate the question. But as soon as you say it has to have a purpose, you're also saying, I have not yet silenced my heart. Because if you silence your heart, you don't care whether it's got a purpose or not. It's just blissful. So I think there are 2 sorts of silence. And I think this seriously. I think there's the silence in which you are silencing everything outside in order to hear your own authentic voice. The poet's silence would be one way of expressing it. And there's the perhaps religious or spiritual silence when the first case, you're trying to fulfill your own authentic inner self, And in the more religious case, you're trying to abandon it. You're trying to self-empty, presumably so that you can hear the voice of God. Now, you won't. So I suppose in that sense, for me, the purpose of silence is to hear the voice of God. But I would have to say it didn't happen every Thursday afternoon.
Thanks.
Is that the right question? Did I understand the question?
Yeah, I've experienced all those things, and I think I'm...
And what do you do next?
I don't know. I think of new ideas to change the world.
I come to Holland and give talks.
Is there anyone else? Yeah.
Also, thank you for your lecture. I would like to ask you, you have a long period of silence, and do you also include a non-period of silence and then perhaps receive guests or relatives, or you said you have also children?
Well, first of all, I've got the dog.
You can talk to him too.
No, I don't talk to him, but certainly he's not very silent. She's not very silent. But I also have two completely wonderful children who are grown up, but nonetheless, occasionally with... Okay, I think, I hear what you're saying. I really do. I do have friends. I don't have a television. I suppose it's not that I'm completely silent, but that I choose more, I exercise more choice over when I do not have silence than many people get to. There's a very, very stern 4th century hermit called Arsenius, and he was immensely severe. And he told some monks they would have to move because there was this sort of patch of reeds in front of their house and they had wind going through them, made a noise, so you just all got to move. And one night, another monk came to him and he was welcomed into the house and he gave him supper and they said the psalms together and then they slept and then they woke up in the morning and he gave him breakfast. And when the young monk was leaving, he said, "I'm sorry, Father, I made you break your rule." And this Arsenius said, "You don't know what my rule is." So the poor brother said, "Well, what is your rule?" And he said, "My rule is to make you welcome in Christ and send you away in peace. The first duty of the hermit is hospitality." So I try and work on the assumption that I never invite anyone, but if they want to come, that should be made to work for them. I mean, unless it's somebody immensely tiresome, in which case, charity. But I think that if I don't want that to happen, then I'd have to take some more like physical risks, like get rid of the telephone. I have a telephone. I do have it unplugged a lot, but it deeply worried my son when we talked about getting rid of it because he said, "Mummy, if you want to live 10 miles away from your next door neighbour, you get a telephone." I just can't cope, with you falling and breaking your ankle and having to sit there for 8 days or whatever. So I do have certain forms of communication. I do have to earn a living because I don't think it's possible to live completely outside the cash economy, really. And anyway, I don't want to. I really, really don't want to live on rather mouldy potatoes all the time, which is about what I could grow where I live. Or spend all my life trying to catch some fish in a very cold, wet river. I can't see it. I can't see that my silence and my serenity and my meditation would be increased by having to go out and shoot rabbits for the stewing pot. You have to make some choices and they have to be appropriate to geography and stuff. It's more about how silent, I'm more interested in how silent is it possible to be than in some abstract measure of silence. And for me at least, for me at least, there are some other needs and they have to be put sensibly into pattern. There needs to love my friends, there needs to be loved by my friends, those are both needs. Ditto for the children. dare indeed for the community that I live in. I live in a very rural community. I don't know if other people live in very rural communities, but if you do, what you find is you become extremely complicatedly dependent on each other. So like not long ago, we had a power outage. You know, we were in the middle of a storm. It was an appalling night. The electricity all went off. And at that time, we had an elderly couple who lived about 2 miles from where I lived. They don't live there anymore. It was all too much for them, very sensibly. So I thought, I've just got to go and see if John and Jasmine are all right. I really, Then I think, because it was pouring with very cold rain, I thought, no, the hermit does not do this. But in the end, I thought, I'd better go and see if they're all right. So I got in all my wet gear and I stomped down the track and I arrived at their house. There was somebody there from every house within 9 miles. That people had just thought, we must see if John and Jasmine are all right. As a matter of fact, we then had a fabulous whiskey-strewn, candlelit piss-up. But, I live in a community where that kind of care would be taken of me. It has to be responded to at some level, I think. People are immensely tolerant of me. If my rather fabulous neighbour, who is the person most likely to pass my house because he keeps the sheep on the hill above where I live. So he's the only person who ever has cause to pass it. If he has something urgent he wants to say to me, he has this little white flag that he waves. So that if it's absolutely impossible for me to talk to him now, I won't go out, but will the next time he comes. And it's sort of a joke. He's teasing me, really. I don't think he believes much in hermits. So I think they're complicated. That's all. I think it's complicated because I think there's an obligation to love. I think there is an obligation to love which has to, just as silence has to have some real concrete reality. You can't just say, I have a silent soul. Now I'll go to the disco. You can't say, I just have a loving heart and my neighbours can freeze to death on this cold night. Some of it's glad I don't get treated that way either. All our water froze up not long ago. We got snowed in up our valley. It was quite weird because we didn't have much snow in the valley. We just couldn't get in or out at either end. Okay? And all the water froze, so we had no water and we had no electricity. This was for 5 or 6 days. We're not talking about no. They did put a helicopter over it every day and dropped us all leaflets saying we could put out these red X's, make them out of something in your house if you needed something urgent, but they'd be very cross if you did. Okay. Every single day, somebody whose name at that stage I did not know bought me 15 litres of water on his quad bike in a jar. I did not discover until after it was all over that he was hand pumping them because his mechanical pump had frozen. He didn't tell me, he just did it. Well, you're going to talk to those people, aren't you? The even better bit of it, which I was not going to say because it's a little embarrassing, is on about day 3 of this, the phone rang because the phone stayed on. Weird. And it was somebody who I really don't know, who lived about 5 miles away from me. And she said, I gave up smoking for New Year and I thought I'd use this downtime to clean the house out. I found a packet of cigarettes. Do you want them? And I walked 5 miles to her house and 5 miles back because, yes, I did. But I think it's a very loving context that somebody who, after all, has had exactly the same pressures as I do, thinks, who'd like these cigarettes? There's a kind of sociability in extreme isolation that I think you have to kind of nourish because otherwise John and Jasmine will die one night and I very much hope one day I'll be older than John and Jasmine were when they left. So I'm very, very keen that people should remember these traditions. It sounds as though I'm joking at your question, and I'm really not. I think there's endless, for anyone who's serious about it, endless questions. What's charity? What's breaking silence? What's self-indulgence? What's good discipline? I think they have to be kind of daily choices. Yeah. I'll give you another daily choice, which is a very interesting one to me. I have a very ropey track that comes off the road. It's really bad. For the weather's wet, it's very bad indeed. And I said to the postman, would he like it if I put a post box at the bottom of the track so he didn't have to bring the car up? And he said, no. And I said, why not, Willie? And he said, because it would make me frightened never to know that you were okay. Huh? Well, you know, I think you say good morning to somebody who's taking that good care of you at least a couple of times a week. Even if it's a technical break of silence, it also supports my capacity to be that silent because Willie takes care of me. Does that make any sense? They have to be minute-by-minute judgments, really. I think that's what it is, or at least day by day.
Now, I admire you, but I don't know if I can live like you. It is
Well, could I suggest then that you don't? I hasten to tell you it's totally non-obligatory. If you feel you ought to do more, find a religious house or even an individual and support them in doing it by sending them a cheese every year. Every hermit needs cheese. All I'm saying is that if you think it's a thing that's worth doing in the world and you don't want to do it yourself, support someone else in doing it. You know?
Maybe we can talk later on because we have to end. But the people of the Cultuurcafé have assured me that they will stay open an extra hour, especially for us. So there's plenty of time to talk on with each other and maybe even with Sara Maitland, who's also happy to sign books. We have, as you may have noticed already, a small book table outside of this lecture hall. You can buy her books and support her financially and have your book signed.
Cheese, I want cheese!
And cigarettes. So for now, thank you very much, Sara Maitland. Thank you, Christiane Alvers. And thank you for being here and being attentive. Hope to see you sometime soon. Oh, and by the way, videos, podcasts, and pictures of this lecture will appear on our website very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, that was really nice.